I wanted to cover some more advanced sort of topics on the data migration framework, but I thought what I might do first is give an overview of some of the concepts because just so that you can understand sort of the flow of how it works. So this is Dynamics AX 2012 R3. So the same concepts will apply for Dynamics 2012 R2 CU7 because the updates for the data migration framework are in CU7. Before that, any version before that, there was an update on the R1, but some of the features are new and only included from CU7 to R3, so that's something that you'll have to reconcile on the version that you're working with. Alright, so a couple of concepts. Firstly, the parameters. So you've got parameters that you need to set up, which is pretty simple. So I won't go through all these options at the moment, so just go through the setup. So first you'll have to set up a shared working directory, which is what gets used temporarily for the data migration in the AOS. Then you'll have to set up source data formats. So source data formats determine the input data that you're going to work. So you have to have one that's an AX, so an AX data format, which is just to AX. Then in this particular case I'm going to use a CSV file format, but you'll see if I go to create another file format, there's the three types, which is file, AX and ODBC. So if you wanted to get data from a source database, then you can use an ODBC connection. So that was quite flexible, so we'll have a look at that later in another video. So in my case I'm just using CSV, and I've put parameters, so it's delimited. How is the row delimited? Carriage, return, line feed. Columns are delimited by a comma. I can have a text qualifier, which is quotes, for example, and the code page. So the code page is obviously important because that determines the encoding of the files that you're bringing into the text that you're bringing in. So this is quite important to understand what's that format. So we'll talk about that later. So that's the main details in terms of the file format setup. What we also need to have is an entity. Now there's two main types of entities. There's a complex entity or something that's a class that gets built around the table structure that you're trying to build. Or it could be just a table. So you'll see, for example, entity and table is what you can use. So if you're using a table, that's going straight into the AX table. So probably okay for simple parameter-based tables, or data that you're importing that is just code and description sort of thing. So we'll use both of these in the example. Entity is something a little bit more complex. So I'm going to go through creating both an entity and also using the table type entity. But I'm not going to do a custom entity in terms of creating it directly from code. I'm going to use the wizard. So those are something that you want to have a look at, like how do you build the entity. Without an entity, you've got no source definition and no target. So the target is obviously where you're trying to put the data into. And without an entity, there's no middleman, so to speak. So your entity is your middleman going into that. So in this example, so we sort of understand the concept, I'm going to build a table from scratch, and then we'll build the entity so that we understand what we need to do here. So let's jump across to the developer workspace. I'm going to create a quick project here. Alright, so this is my quick project. So first I'm going to go and build a new table. So I'm just going to call my table my data import table just for the purposes of the exercise. So in it I'm just going to put two fields. So we'll open another AOT, and I'm just going to grab some data types. So I'm going to grab the number, and I'm going to grab a description, Alright, so this represents the data that I'm going to bring in this case. Again, simple, just so that we can go through the concepts here. I'm going to put an index on it. Again, not really following all AX best practices, but just for the purposes of the exercise. So I'm going to say this is my primary key, allow duplicates, and I'll also make it our alternate key, and I'm going to make that the should show up now my primary key, and we could make it the clustered index as well. Okay, so that's our table built. We've got the two fields on it. So I'm going to put this into my project, and I'm going to go and build a form. So again, just a simple form for the sake of the exercise. So I'm going to build it based on my data import, and I'll put a grid. Okay, so the reason I've got my form is that because in the data import and export framework, there's a link, so when you bring in the data you can have a look at it. So I'm going to build a menu item, because when we use the entity wizard, it will ask for a menu item which is used in the display. So that's my menu item created. I'm just going to give it a quick label. Okay, and I'm going to put that in my project. Alright, so at this stage I've got my basic table that I'm going to use for our sample data import and export. Now, let's jump over to the data import and export framework, and we have an option here to create a custom entity for data import and export. So I'm going to run this wizard, and you'll see it asks for the table name. So our table name, of course, was data EMP table. So simple enough. We're going to ask for that, and so this will populate the artifacts that it's going to go and create, and you'll see a display menu item. So our display menu item was the one that we created. So data imp table form, and so you'll see that that's our display method. So we can auto-generate data either from a query or a method. We'll talk about that later, but in our case I'm just going to leave it from the method. So this is our fields in our entity. We can choose to exclude and exclude them. In that case I'm just going to use all of them because I've only got two, and then we're finished. So it's going to go and generate it. I'll just pause the video while it works. Okay, so those are the objects that are now created. So we have in the data dictionary a new table called DMF data import table entity, and it's updated a standard table, which is the data entity table, and we have a new update to the data entity type, which represents our new table that we've created. And we've got a query for that and a class. So the class is what gets built from the framework to do the work in terms of moving from the data into the staging or to put validation and stuff on it. So again, we're going to go into the details of those. We'll cover that later. So at this stage we have the entity created, and that means that we can go into the target entities and go and populate this list. So if we say entity, we can now put a name into it. So data EMP table. We can specify the table, which will be the one that we created from the wizard. So you'll see if I scroll through the list here, we have the data imp table entity. So this is the staging table, which is what was created for us. Okay, and then we can pick the entity class. Again, it's the one that was generated from the wizard for us. So if we look through the list, okay, so because of the refresh, it's not in alphabetical order. So I'm going to find it so it's right at the end here. So data imp table entity, and we can find the target entity. So data import table entity. Okay, so that effectively gives us our entity created and populated. So we can now use this in the processing group. So I'll go and create a processing group. So the processing group is the one that actually does the work. So I'm going to put data imp here, data imp, and when we save it, you'll see that we can specify the entity. So this is where we make the association between that processing group that executes and manages the work and the entity that we've created. So if we have a look through the list, we called it data imp table. There's the entity. We can specify the source format, so CSVs in this particular case. Now, if you want, you can generate a source file. So the source file will guide you through the fields that are in that table and generate a template file for you. So we're going to run that option. So pick those. I'm going to generate the sample file. So you'll see it just pops up a notepad with the number and the description here. So I'm just going to save this. My data migration folder, sample import text file. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So we'll finish here. So let's go and manipulate that file. So this is the data migration path. This is the file that was created. So in here, I'm going to populate values. So I'm going to put this my data line 1, data line 2, for example, and I'm just going to hit delete, make sure I've got no empty rows, because you'll get an error about duplicate records if you've got empty lines at the end of the file. So I'm just cleaning out my file in this particular case. Okay, so that's my 2 sample records I've put into my text file. So if we go back to the entity creation here, if I go and browse, if we go and look for our sample file, if we say preview the sample file, see that gives us the error on the target mapping. So here we have to generate the source target mapping. So if we hit this, if it can successfully take that source input file and map it to the fields in the entity, then it'll generate the source mapping. If it can't match it, then you'll have to come into the mapping and then manually map. In our case, because we've got a very simple mapping, it'll automatically match it, and because we generate it from the entity, it's going to match it for us. Okay, so it's matched. Again, we'll come back and talk about mappings at another point. So if I hit the preview again now, you'll see that it imports our sample data in this particular case. So that means we've got the entity created and the mapping done. Okay, so we can hit close on this processing group. So this is our processing group. So at this stage it's ready, so we can actually hit the option to get the staging data. So in this case it creates a job. So the job is something that you want to keep a record of, or name them, or give them descriptions, because this is stored in the staging table so that you can potentially import data multiple times, but it's mapped against the job, and you can see and run specific jobs from staging across the target later, for example. So you can do incremental imports into a table using different jobs, for example, and just keep rerunning the processing job. So this is the staging data execution form. There are quite a lot of little forms in here, so if I go down to the details I can see some options. First row is the header, which is our case. Do I want to create an error file? And again, you've got the preview there. So if you hit the preview button, it'll go and read the file and give you the preview. So when I hit run, I can do this in batch, but in this case I'm going to do it interactive, so I'm not going to choose batch processing, so I'm just going to say OK. So it'll tell me 2 records have been inserted into staging. So if we look at the execution history now, I can see that I've processed that job already, and if I want I can actually go and view the data in staging. At this stage the data is not in the target table, it's just in the staging, and this is the difference between an entity and a table entity. If it is a table entity and I didn't go through that process of building the entity, the data would be directly into the target or directly into the real table in AX. So those are the differences between entity and table. Now when we created the menu item in the wizard, that was to our form, and this is what the form is doing for us, is populating that form so that we can see the data in the form. Alrighty, now you'll see this is the one job run. For example, if I rerun it again, so I'm going to go and get staging data. This is my job number 2, so I'm going to import it again and just say run. Now we didn't change the source, but it's going to import those 2 records. So at this stage, if we look at the execution history, now we've done 2 runs. So if I look at the staging data, there's 2 records in there, and look at this job, there's 2 records in there. So if we're going to have a look at the actual staging table, which is the one that was created with the wizard, if we have a look in the details, you'll see I've got 4 records, and those are keyed against the jobs. So this gives you the ability to choose and clean up data that you might want to experiment with, or incrementally add data into a table through multiple jobs when you don't have all of the data in one go. So you can either play with those, and then once you're ready you can simply hit copy data to target. So you'll see before I run that process, this is my actual table, this is the one we created. It doesn't have any data in there. So until I run this copy data to target, and I'm doing it for this particular job, I'm going to say OK, and this is going to be the details, so 2 records. It's going to hit run. Again, you could process in a batch, 2 records written to the table. So at this point, if we go and have a look at our table, our real table, well, now we've got 2 records in the table. We'll also have a status if we hit refresh, so you'll see the 2 jobs. So this one, staging, is imported and ended. Target status is ended. So this one, you'll see the target status didn't run. That's because of course we didn't run it. So that data's in staging but not in the target. We didn't move that over. So if you run multiple jobs, you can see which jobs you've actually got and filter out and look at that. details there. So this is something just for management of how do you move that data. Is it in one big go or is it incrementally, for example? You'll see back on the main processing group screen we have copied data to target. So if you didn't look through all the things, if you hit copy data to target, it's just going to go straight into the table from that staging data that you've built in. So that's a really quick walkthrough of building a new table, building an entity, and processing it through staging into the application. Now, what happens if we use the table entity? So if I go into target, if I hit new and if I go into my target entities, I'm going to create a new one called table. And in this particular case, I'm going to say data import direct table. Okay, so this is going to be my entity name, and in this particular case I'm going to go straight to my table. So I can say data imp table is where I want to go into. Now you'll notice that we don't need to specify the entity class and the target entity because we're going straight into that table. We're missing the staging process. So the actual table now becomes our target directly in there. So let's go and do a new processing group and see how this runs. So go into our processing group. I'm going to say data so we got different. I'm going to hit save so we can do our entity. If we look for our entity, data imp direct table, so this is again direct, missing the entity. So if you're confident about the data and you don't need to process it through staging, then you can go and use a table. Now this is my sample file. I'm just going to change the records in here. So let's make this 3, 4, 3, 4. So this is our sample data. I'm going to save that. So if we go and browse for the file, I can generate my source mapping. We can look at the mapping. It should be alright because we know it's just fairly simple, number and description, and we can choose a preview if we want. So 3, 4 is our records here, so that's okay. So that's our processing group created. So now when I hit get staging data, it's going to run our job. So we're going to say okay, and you'll see in our real table we've still got the 2 records there. Okay, so if we go to our staging, again we could hit preview if we wanted to look at the record, so that all applies. But when I hit run, it's going to run. So 2 records inserted. If we have a look at the table directly, now I've actually got the 1, 2, 3, 4, so the 2 from earlier and the new one, so I've gone directly into the table. So that's the main difference between the usage of the entity, so an actual entity and then a table entity. So that was a quick run through of like how you build the entity and how to use them, and then the processing group. There are lots of different sort of options of looking at the data, exporting it, and messing with it. I'll cover some of those usages in another video. But I hope this has given you a quick overview at least of getting started with the data import and export framework and what some of the concepts are.